Hello, I'm Richard Tors from the History of Art Department, and I'm delighted to introduce my colleague Robert Mills, who is Professor of Medieval Studies and also Director of QCL, UCL's LGBTQ Research Network. Bob's research mainly focuses on the visual culture and literature of England and France between the 13th and 15th centuries. He's also published on art in the Low Countries, Germany, Italy, and northern Spain, and has long-standing interests in gender and sexuality, both as historical phenomena and as critical categories, and has published a number of chapters and articles in this field. Bob is the author of the books Suspended Animation, Pain, Pleasure and Punishment in Medieval Culture, which was published by Reaction in 2005, and Seeing Sodomy in the Middle Ages, published by Chicago in 2015, which won the Society for French Studies Gapper Book Prize. And he's also published a number of edited books on topics as diverse as medieval translation, sexuality and sight in medieval image and text, and the monstrous Middle Ages. And he's also recently completed another book, Derek Jarman's Medieval Modern, due out in April, quick plug there, which uses Jarman's long-standing interests in medieval art and literature as a window onto topics such as anachronism, periodization, and the politics of time. And Bob is now turning his attention to questions of animality and sovereignty in medieval visual culture, and is currently completing a book project on this theme. And it's that topic that Bob will be talking about to us today. Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard, and thanks everyone for coming out on a very snowy day. So the title of my talk is The Birds and the Bees, Animal Sex in Medieval Art. Now, many criteria have been traditionally used to differentiate humans from other animals, whether it's language or reason, politics or ethics, history or culture. Humans have traditionally associated themselves with one or other quality to which they, as a species, can uniquely lay claim. While the category of sex doesn't usually appear high up on the list of distinguishing characteristics, attributing to non-human animals a sex life, which is to say an area of life involving sexual activity that's not solely driven by the goal of biological reproduction, potentially smacks of anthropomorphism, of projecting our human-centric modes of thought onto the world around us. So, for example, the image of pandas spicing up their sex lives with a dose of panda porn, as reported in a string of recent news stories, has the capacity to scandalize and entertain a modern audience precisely because such phenomena as pornography are thought to be exclusively or predominantly human. Yet sexuality has also been identified as one of the most potentially animalizing of all human activities, the trait that brings humans into closest proximity with their bestial selves. So today I want to introduce you to some of the diverse strategies that were adopted by medieval artists to confront this issue. Taking an example from different categories of illuminated manuscript, including hunting manuals, bestiaries, and scientific treatises, I want to show how the makers of these books generated a surprisingly varied response to the topic of animal sex. I'll also be asking how depictions of animals having sex have been used to represent and contemplate human sexual and gender diversity, including bodies that were deemed in the language of the time to be sodomitic or hermaphroditic. Finally, I'll be asking how such imagery might allow us to reflect with renewed insight on the exuberance and multiplicity of living creatures. So the first section of the lecture I'm calling Doing It Like a Human. And I want to begin with this image, which appears in an illuminated copy of a book known as the Livre de Chasse, or Book of the Hunt. And this is a book that was authored by a rich hunting enthusiast called Gaston Phébus. It was made, this particular copy of this book was made in Paris in 1407. It's a luxurious manuscript. It contains 87 illustrations representing various aspects of the aristocratic hunt. And the book's opening chapters provide a series of detailed accounts of the natures of the animals that are involved in hunting. So the scene you're looking at here accompanies the 8th chapter, which is on bears. Now, as in every account of field knowledge in this book, the author, Gaston Phébus, draws attention in his text to the bear's mating habits. This and other animals' sexual activity is described using a language that's both similar to and different from the language that's applied to humans. We're informed that the desire of bears to mate is awakened in December when they go into their love, their amour, as the text puts it. But the sentence ends by stating that bears remain in heat for 15 days, thus highlighting the cyclical nature of sex among bears compared with sex among humans. But despite these differences between human and animal, the author also concludes with the striking observation that when a male bear expresses his need with a female companion, the couple perform in the guise of a man and a woman, one laid out on top of the other. And this is a position that's envisaged to the right of the illustration, as you're seeing here, as a face-to-face coupling of two differently coloured bears. Now, the idea that bears have human-like sex is carried over from medieval bestiaries. Bestiaries were a type of book that were designed to present a Christianized interpretation of the natural world. Bestiaries state that bears do not copulate like other four-legged creatures, but joined in mutual embraces, they copulate just as in human unions. In these accounts of bear sex, the bear's human-like attributes thus extend to hugging one another in the throes of passion. They're also described as caring for their helpless offspring, as seen in the example here from one of these books known as Bestiaries. And this illustrates how, in the eyes of the bestiary author, bears are born as shapeless lumps of flesh, depicted in the illustration here as these stylized reddish-tinged rocks that have to be licked into proper shape by their mothers. Similarly, Gaston's hunting book describes how bear cubs are born as if dead until a mother licks them back to life and nourishes them with regurgitated food. Now, within the religious framework of the bestiary, this act was interpreted as shedding light on the relationship between human and divine. So the unformed bear cub was interpreted as a symbol for the unformed mind being set on a virtuous path after it's been imbued with the word of God. And this is an idea that's believed to be at the root of the modern expression to be licked into shape. While Gaston Phébus's Book of the Hunt doesn't share the bestiary's spiritual purpose, several family groupings within the illustration of bears emphasize the cub's dependency on their mothers. What's more, the colouring of the bears arguably transforms marks of species difference into signifiers of sexual difference. So Gaston's chapter on the bears opens with a statement declaring that although their natures are identical, black bears are distinct from brown ones in terms of size and strength. Needless to say, in the accompanying image, the illuminator uses colour contrast as a means of expressing differences between male and female. Each pair of bears embracing and copulating consists of a brown and black exemplar. Now, of course, the artist may have included these features simply for aesthetic reasons. A roughly alternating pattern of black and brown fur set against a grassy landscape echoes the checkered pattern that you see in the background. But it's striking that the creatures attributed with the most humanoid sexual habits in this hunting treatise are physically differentiated in this way. Significantly, chapter 9 of the Book of the Hunt, which focuses on boars, is illustrated with an image that differentiates male and female even more stridently. Boars possess testicles and prominent white tusks, whilst boar piglets suckle from their mother's conspicuous dugs. Males and females of the species are also, like bears, depicted with differently coloured fur. So in some manuscripts of the text, the boar mounting his partner during sex even has a clearly visible erection, which is highlighted in pink or red, while his semi-upright stance and spirited expression contrast with the sow's seeming passivity. Although no textual reference is made in either the bestiary or the Book of the Hunt to the boar's manner of mating, the bestiary places special emphasis on the boar's wild and unruly character, which is linked to the savagery of Satan. Now, although these demonic associations are absent from the Book of the Hunt, in the text, Gaston emphasises the boar's fearsome strength as the world's best-armed beast. The parallel location of this scene of sexual activity, and this appears just 2 pages after the image of bears in the throes of their love-making, serves visually to accentuate the contrast between bears and boars. The mounting position of boars characterizes them as typically bestial in their passions, a stark reminder of the exceptional status of bear sex compared to that of other animals. And these images also emphasize the boar's virility, which could be interpreted as a surrogate for the author's own masculinity. In the preface to his treatise, Gaston announces that he delights especially in 3 things in life, namely arms, love, and hunting. And this suggests that in the author's eyes, as in the eyes of many of his aristocratic contemporaries, the pursuits of warfare, women, and animals were perceived as being fundamentally interchangeable. So in a sense then, these scenes also hint at the porousness of distinctions between human and animal. One species, the bear, is being singled out as the exception that proves the general rule of bestial behavior. Through such traits as copulating face to face, bears are symbolically elevated to human status. Whilst another species, the boar, is more typically animal in his sexual habits. But the illustrations also act as foils and possibly mirrors for the author's own sexual identity. Yet despite these possible transgressions of the animal-human border, sex is linked indissolubly with reproduction. Significantly, the boar and bear illustrations feature the only explicit depictions of animal copulation in the entire book. Other illustrations showing creatures associated with the hunt, such as this cosy scene of a hart and its young, evoke the ends of animal sex, but not the means. So when it comes to imagining erotic encounters among non-human animals, the Book of the Hunt doesn't paint a particularly varied picture. Okay, so the next section of the lecture I'm calling biological exuberance, and I'm going to come back to what I mean by this concept of biological exuberance in a moment. One of the overriding messages of the Book of the Hunt concerns the mastery of animals for the purposes of aristocratic pleasure and human consumption. Hence, the book's makers don't explicitly countenance the possibility that non-humans might be engaged in sex outside the sphere of biological reproduction. When animal sex is represented in these books, it's associated with the propagation of new life and new animal existences to dominate. Now, in many respects, this mirrors attitudes expressed about animal sex within the natural sciences, at least until quite recently. The prevailing view has tended to be that animal sex is predominantly reproductive and relentlessly heterosexual, that such activities as same-sex relations among animals of the same species can be explained away as expressions of, for example, non-sexual dominance or pseudo-copulation, and that sexual pleasure is the preserve of humanity alone. Arguing against these views, however, some biologists, such as Bruce Bagamiel, have demonstrated how animal sex actually constitutes an array of behaviors, life histories, gender expressions, and body types. Reproduction itself is, Bagamiel argues, marginal to many animals. Animal lives aren't organized exclusively around procreation, while the heterosexuality that's imposed by scientists on non-human animals is presumptive and mistaken. So turning, as I now want to do, to other examples of bestiary manuscripts, there's a clear thread of continuity that I think connects medieval views on animal sex to some of the assumptions and presumptions of modern science. In the world evoked by bestiarists, reproductive sex and the polarities between male and female do indeed have a role to play, what Bagamiel calls a traditional Noah's Ark view of biology, which revolves around 2 sexes, male and female, each one consigned to a pair whose union engenders the replication of that pattern, is as prominent in medieval Christian thought as it is in the writings of scientists in later centuries. And yet, behind these prescriptive grids, the bestiary also reveals considerable variety. Now, this isn't to say that bestiaries necessarily afford their readers a sustained vision of what Bagamiel calls biological exuberance. And what he means by that is the idea that sexual and gender diversity among animals is simply one of any number of expressions of biological vitality, a profusion of possibilities that can't simply be contained within the paradigms of procreation. But nor does it necessarily filter animal relations through the lens of what we call heterosexuality, at least as that term is commonly understood today. So the hyena, which reputedly, according to medieval thought, possesses male and female sex organs and uses them indiscriminately, is perhaps the best known example of a creature that disrupts these models. Depicted in some manuscripts, as in this one here from the Bodleian Library in Oxford, with enlarged humanoid genitals, the beast's gender-switching behaviour was moralised as a figure for Jewish duplicity, and this is part of a strand of anti-Jewish sentiment that sometimes found its way into these books. Conversely, the beaver, who reputedly castrates himself to escape human hunters and flings his genitals at his pursuer, is likened to a chaste man of God. So you'll see that's sort of what's being represented here, the testicles sort of being removed there from the, well, he's sort of removing them himself, and then one of the hunters is sort of grabbing onto them. Other beasts whose sexual habits were turned into Christian morals include vipers, who are condemned as serial adulterers with a predilection for fellatio. So here you see the male viper who's spitting semen into the mouth of the female partner, while her offspring are simultaneously eating their way out of her belly. So the sort of message is basically that oral sex does not end well. And then the elephant and his wife, whose lack of interest in sex, unless it's for reproductive ends, symbolises chaste marriage and Adam and Eve before the fall. So you see the sort of the elephants there, and there's sort of a Christ-like figure here who's sort of pointing, holding the hands of Adam and Eve and pointing to them as if they're a kind of model. And bees, who breed without sexual union, which, as you might guess, is interpreted as a figure for the virgin birth. Animals thus allowed the makers of these books to contemplate such mysterious or taboo practices as oral sex or promiscuity, while simultaneously naturalizing the religious ideals of chastity and the miracle of incarnation. Sometimes, as in the beaver or elephant, a trait is promoted as exemplary for Christian readers. But in the hyena's case, the creature's sexual habits are viewed as profoundly troubling. The beast's oversexed body provides an apt metaphor in the moralist's mind for the dangers of religious and possibly racial difference. But it also implicitly connotes sodomy, which was associated with acts of gender inversion and gender switching. So here's a verse from a satirical poem by a 12th century monk called Bernard of Cluny, which makes precisely this connection whilst condemning the sins of Sodom. So he says, unnaturally and insanely he becomes she. O madness, O terror, the male, unmindful of his manliness, is like a hyena. So inevitably, the bestiary discovers in such creatures as bears and hyenas mirrors of human experience, even when, as in the phenomenon of virgin birth, the circumstances are uniquely biblical. But the point is that an assortment of gender and expressions of gender and sexuality can be discovered in non-human animals. The worldview imparted by these books is thus less clearly heterosexual than it might at first appear. Animals don't simply function as figures for the sexual and gender norms of people, but also represent departures from those perceived norms. What's more, human virtue is measured not against heterosexuality as such, but chastity, as imaged by the beaver's self-mortification and the elephant's restraint. So although, as we've seen, medieval artists were working with a strong sense of sexual difference, they were preoccupied perhaps less with heterosexuality than with the need for all humans to channel their desires towards God. Despite a commonly held assumption that animals in medieval bestiaries are predominantly symbolic, these depictions also reveal bestiaries as a potential source of field knowledge and observation. And so it's therefore worth highlighting how some of the examples I've been citing conform to aspects of modern scientific thinking. So, for example, Bruce Bagamill reports how hyenas are, in fact, ambiguously gendered. Elephants reproduce only once every few years, and male and female elephants typically live apart. Virgin birth and celibacy are a reality among several species, and some creatures really do engage in a version of oral sex. Oh, and then there's those male beavers, who do apparently appear to lack testicles due to the fact they live in cold water, so their genitals are located internally. So some scholars have argued that a distinction between the medieval bestiary's so-called symbolic approach to its subject matter and a more naturalistic or scientific approach doesn't necessarily apply. Bagamill's analysis of modern science confirms this view by suggesting that often some of the most seemingly preposterous beliefs about animals as disseminated in ancient mythology or indigenous cultures do in fact have a grain of truth. Conversely, some of the most pervasive modern presumptions concerning non-human sex and sexual reproduction turn out themselves to be mythical. Okay, so my final section is called Weird Science. So my final examples are taken from a medieval book that translates and comments on the biological works of the ancient philosopher Aristotle. 3 treatises by Aristotle on the history, parts, and generation of animals circulated in Latin in the Middle Ages under the title De Animalibus, on animals, via a translation from Arabic that was made in the early 13th century. Subsequently, this translation in Latin from Arabic was disseminated in several commentaries, including most influentially a massive work by the Dominican scholar Albert the Great, who died around 1280. Albert's text consists of a running commentary on Aristotle's treatises in the form of a gloss with extensive explanations and speculations. A 14th century copy of Albert's book, which was owned by scholars at the Sorbonne in Paris, contains a series of striking images depicting copulating creatures. Now, although Albert and Aristotle were prepared to acknowledge the existence of sexual pleasure among non-human animals, so potentially challenging the view that sex is only oriented towards reproduction, but the makers of this particular manuscript perpetuate the belief that humans are unique when it comes to satisfying their desires. So the page I'm showing here seems to be making a clear distinction between human and non-human by depicting horses, fishes, birds, and snakes enthusiastically copulating, while the human couple appears somewhat coy, even prudish by comparison. One possible explanation for this is that unlike other animals, humans are conscious of the shame that's attached to sex, and so they do it silently and behind closed doors. Now, this interpretation rests on an earlier passage in Albert's commentary, in which Albert reflects on Aristotle's contention that all animals with voices except humans are, as he puts it, very noisy and garrulous when they mate. Now, this doesn't actually correspond to Aristotle's original text, which states, and remember this is in a translation which has come to us via Greek, Arabic, and Latin, and then into English here. But this particular version says, all animals, without exception, exercise their power of singing or chattering, chiefly in connection with the intercourse of the sexes. Now, Albert was working principally with a Latin translation of an Arabic copy of Aristotle's text, and that may explain the confusion here. Also, the idea erroneously attributed to Aristotle that humans are the only animals who remain silent when it comes to sex contradicts Albert's own investigations. So Albert clarifies that this claim only holds true for the period prior to copulation and not during the sex act itself. Similarly, while he says a human may be quiet out of shame as he approaches intercourse, he nevertheless signals his desire noisily in the build-up through activities such as singing. So what's represented by Aristotle is a clear distinction between humans and other animals, at least in the version of Aristotle's text with which Albert the Great is working. Turns out only to apply to the sex act itself. Humans, like all other vocal creatures, preface sexual relations with spirited displays of noise. Now, in a related work by Albert the Great, a series of lectures that he delivered in Cologne in the 1250s that were collated by one of his students under the title Questions on Animals, Albert further meditates on the issue of noisy sex. So whereas cocks, horses, and other creatures are vociferous, he says, a human male, as if preparing for war, arms the penis silently and stealthily and has intercourse. And then he continues by saying that whereas sperm causes brute animals to cry out due to the delight they feel in their members when emitting sperm, the human animal is, he says, discreet and prudent thanks to reason, and has discretion, and therefore can abstain on account of shame from those acts towards which coition is ordered. To the contrary, if he can, he lies down hiddenly, and the more hiddenly, the more sweet it is. So the images inserted at the beginning of this, the fifth book of Albert's commentary, clearly conform to this distinction between secrecy and silence of humans in sex and the boisterousness of other animals. So look at the donkey's vivacious, open-mouthed expression as he mounts the whinnying mare, or see the cock opening its beak as it inseminates the hen. By contrast, the human couple communicate only through sight and touch. Their lower bodies are completely removed from view. Humans are thus visibly differentiated from other animals in terms of their predilection for discretion. And elsewhere on the page, we're afforded a glimpse of copulating creatures that correspond to other details in Albert's commentary. For instance, the artist illustrates Albert's statement that is seen with his own eyes how fish sometimes mate belly to belly. Also, although Albert himself maintains that no animal copulates through the mouth, the scene, oddly enough, features a pair of birds touching their beaks. Similarly, when Albert describes sex between serpents, he says only that they wrap around one another during copulation. But in the illustration, the illuminator draws in an alternative tradition derived from the ancient author Pliny the Elder, in which copulating serpents are said to take on the appearance of a single creature with two heads. These anomalies represent an effort on the part of the artist to reconcile ancient materials with existing traditions. But the images are also making an additional point, which connects them directly with the opening lines of Book 5 of Albert's text, which these images are illustrating. These lines state how in such matters as the copulation of animals, there exists a great deal of diversity, and I've just highlighted the word there in the middle, diversitatis, in the nature of animals. So diversity is crucial to this illustration of Albert's text. It's not simply that humans differ from all other animals, but that within the category of the non-human animal exists a spectrum of possibilities. Snakes do it differently from chickens and flamingos. Fish rub bellies. Mammals mate through mounting. And even within the broad category of birds, there exists diversity of practice, as represented by the beak-touching pair. Recent debates within animal studies have drawn attention to the violence of the word animal, stemming especially from the way in which the category establishes a single, indivisible limit between humans and all other creatures. My point is that these illustrations of creaturely sex in a medieval scientific commentary visibly convey a measure of that multiplicity. Humans are separated from other animals, but this doesn't simply work to generate a homogeneous category of the non-human against which the human is opposed. Rather, these illustrations imagine animal as a category that itself admits division. To reinforce this point, let me show you two more scenes from this manuscript. Book 16 of Albert's commentary is devoted to the powers of reproduction, including a detailed explication of Aristotle's classic theory that female is to matter as male is to form. And this also leads to a short digression on how animals of different species sometimes copulate with one another. Significantly, despite being a relatively minor feature in Albert's text, our artist has chosen to highlight cross-species copulation in the accompanying images. So in an initial D, a teacher who represents Aristotle sits before a group of students and points towards two diminutive naked figures, and the male's visible penis and the female's breasts conform to the emphasis in the text on sexual difference as a principle of generation among humans, who, as in Albert's terms, the most perfect animals atop of the natural hierarchy. Lower beings, such as plants, reproduce without the need for sexual division, while propagation among imperfect animals is prone to disorder and multiplicity. So in the scenes at the foot of the page, showing copulating creatures, the couples are differentiated by species rather than sex. A horse mounts a donkey mounts a miniature pony, a wolf has intercourse with a dog, and a dog has sex with a wolf. Again, as in the scenes of copulating animals at the beginning of Book 5, humans are clearly being treated as a separate entity from other animals, notably through their framing within the borders of an initial. Albert only discusses interspecies sex insofar as it concerns animals further down the hierarchy. Human bestiality is beyond the pale. But within that broad category of other than human animals, animal sex is again presented as a sphere of multiple possibilities, sometimes even entailing interactions across species lines, as you're seeing here. Adding further weight to this argument, and my last example, is a scene at the beginning of Albert's 18th book, which focuses on principles of generation and sex difference among humans. This section of the commentary includes a lengthy digression on monsters. Again, the decorated initial features the seated philosopher pointing to a diminutive man and woman, except this time they're clothed. And the students being taught, you'll notice, possess the heads of a bull and ram. In the text, Albert asserts that such mutations occur more often in animals other than humans, holding that monstrous births are usually the result of copulation between creatures of species with comparable natures. But instead of depicting the results of interspecies unions envisioned in Book 16, as we saw just before, the artist has included on this page a drawing of a lion man. This is a creature for which there's in fact no equivalent in the text. Other monstrosities result from a multiplication of members, says Albert, as in those humans born possessing both sexes. The illustrator consequently treats readers to a vision of sexual division to the left with an image of a naked male touching the stomach of a heavily pregnant female. But this is contrasted with a rare medieval image of an intersexed person possessing both male and female genitalia, which conforms to Albert's description of the monstrosity he calls hermaphrodite. These images acknowledge that even within the human animal, there exists sexual variation. Not every body is contained within the binaries that Aristotle and Albert the Great characterize as the natural order of things. And animal sex itself is kaleidoscopic. Even within the sphere of reproduction, there's potential for diversity, whether in the means or in the ends. As such, the examples I've been discussing arguably both confirm the existence of a division between humans and other animals in medieval thought, and simultaneously show how, within the broad category of animal, there was room for variety and multiplicity. This, in turn, may allow us to reflect with renewed insight on the exuberance and diversity that's been identified by some of Albert the Great's successors within modern science. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that fascinating and incredibly rich lecture. I'm going to throw it open now for questions. If I could ask you to wait for the roving microphone to reach you before you ask your question, it'd be much appreciated.
Thanks for the lecture. Are there any ideas about the ancestry of this, going back to classical times, for example?
So, could you just say again the ancestry?
Ideas about the ancestry of this, of these ideas, going back to classical times, for example?
Sure. Well, I guess, I mean, it depends which particular kinds of book you're talking about, because, of course, the sort of medieval genres that I'm talking about, like the bestiary, are based on a sort of inheritance that is coming from ancient thought. So the bestiary, as a group of texts, is derived in particular from an ancient text called the Physiologus. And so a lot of the sort of ideas are sort of being translated into a sort of medieval Christianized form. So I think, so this is sort of part of a much longer and very rich and complex tradition. And also I've mentioned some other people who are sort of informing this tradition as well, like Pliny the Elder, for instance, who produces this, this sort of natural history, which has a lot of ideas that you sort of see circulating in various forms in the Middle Ages. And I think what Albert the Great is then doing with his commentary on Aristotle is trying to reconcile some of those ideas that are circulating in genres like the bestiary, and then trying to match that up with observation and experience, and saying, okay, sometimes there's something wrong here. So, for example, he does dispute the idea that snakes, when they copulate, they sort of form this sort of two-headed, one-bodied thing, even though it turns up in the illustration of that manuscript, as I showed. But he says, that's not how it actually happens, because I've observed this and it happens differently. So I think there is this sort of tension that's coming through here between different kinds of ancient ideas, whether it's based on Aristotle, who's sort of himself sort of very much promoting observation and experience, and then on the other hand, this sort of more what you might sort of see as sort of folkloric kind of traditions around animals and animal sex, and then trying to sort of show how they sometimes don't match up.
Where do you think the illuminators got their ideas of what some of these animals looked like? I mean, obviously they would be familiar with horses and dogs and so on, but bears and hyenas clearly not so much.
Absolutely. That's a very interesting question. I think there is a sort of difference, as you sort of pointed out in your question, between species that people might have been familiar with in the context, in a domestic context, in the context of agriculture, and then some of the sort of more exotic species or even mythical creatures. So there are some in the bestiary. There are sort of animals that turn up that don't have any precise equivalent that we know about. So whether that's sort of a beast like the unicorn. Or there's this creature known as the bonoson, which is a sort of a combination of a kind of bull and a horse. And one of its distinguishing features is that it emits really large farts. And that's discussed in the bestiary, that context. And so how you sort of decide what a creature like that looks like, it's sort of somewhat left up to the imagination. So there is a sort of tradition that develops. But then that tradition, the elephant is another sort of interesting example there. Interestingly, in the 13th century, which is when it's the sort of high point for these manuscripts, the bestiary manuscripts, the sort of big period when they're being produced is between around 1200 and 1250. It's also in the 13th century that the chronicler Matthew Paris, a monk who's based at St Albans, actually produces these famous drawings of elephants, which are reputedly produced based on actual experience of seeing an elephant which came to the Tower of London, which was a gift from the King of France to Henry III, King of England, and where you start to see what is sort of often thought of as a sort of more naturalistic depiction of the elephant. So people were able to sort of, change their sort of viewpoint based on experience. But I think what's interesting in the bestiary is the colouring of these, animals is particularly the sort of feature that sort of, doesn't map onto sort of modern expectations. So you get sort of animals sort of with sort of blue skin and things like that. And I think the decisions there are more aesthetic. It's designed to sort of produce a colourful and entertaining image rather than, being based on any desire to sort of, render the natural world in a sort of realistic form.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop there, but I'd like to thank you, Bob, for a wonderful talk. Thank you.